Hi there, my name is Moray. Welcome to Moray's Muse, an anti-AI generated history channel. Today we are talking about the life of Robert Graves. Now we usually cover historical figures on this channel, but Robert Graves has such a multi-layered life. He's most famously known for Claudius, if you're here in the UK, but he was also a poet and historian himself, and other historians did not like Robert Graves' translations of Suetonius, let me tell you. The man had an incredible life. He was a productivity king. So before we get into how Claudius could have been a cash grab, before we get into the controversial translation of Suetonius, and how we talk about how Robert himself identified more as a poet than a novelist or a historian, let's talk about his early life. Robert Graves is born on July the 24th, 1895 in Wimbledon. His ancestry was a blueprint for why he became a historian, Celtologist, and prolific writer. His father, Alfred Percival Graves, was an Irish school inspector, and he was part of the Gaelic revival. His mother, Emily, was the grandniece of a prominent German historian. His father was a Celtic romanticist, and his mother came from German historians, and this was kind of like a contradiction. It was I don't know whether it was a contradiction or juxtaposition, but he came from a very varied background. Here's the problem though. He had a German name in pre-war England. Pre-war England. Graves was severely bullied. So Graves was really into boxing and mountain climbing, and then he would seek refuge in poetry and classics. Graves was supposed to go to St. John's College in Oxford, where he had secured, obviously, his classical education, but World War I happens, so Graves goes into the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and he has a deep sense of historical continuity. I mean, one thing the army does have is a lot of history, or they kind of like drill it into you, the nationalism element. Robert Graves, he served in France between 1915 and 1917. He had a near fatal injury at the Somme in 1916, and he was officially reported to be dead. But this had equated him with this permanent sense of being like a survivor, right? And the subsequent, like, he survived death. And the subsequent life that he got from this was just a bonus. His experience in the army was kind of like a death and a rebirth time for Graves. Secured a fascination with death and rising gods of mythology. So classics has always been a point of love in Graves' life. You know, he was supposed to go to Oxford to study classics. And if you look at the Edwardian school system at the time, classics was a thing in the Edwardian school system, but it was very different from the study of classics we have today. He finally gets into Oxford, like he was meant to, but he changed his course. He studied English language and literature. To him, classics, the detached study of classics, Latin and Greek, were not so good for his health. He had shell shock, and rather than study classics, which seemed quite cold and hard at the time, he wanted to explore his emotions. But his classics, it was inherent in him. And despite leaving his course, his love of classics was inherent in him. It's like how I feel about my love of classics. Like, I was born with it because of my family past. He was famous for his analeptic thought when it came to his novels. He defined this as the deliberate suspension of time, so he applied a more mythological approach to classics rather than like a timelined approach. And Graves did go back to classics. He's famous for translating Suetonius's 12 Caesars, and historians critiqued his translation style. Critics said Graves often over-translated classical texts, and he simplified technical terms. I'm going to talk about Claudius now. Claudius, especially to Brits who adore the classical era, Claudius is everything. You know, it's the piece of classical media, not only the TV show, but the book that stands the test of time. But to Graves, he needed the money. Graves saw himself as a poet who only wrote novels for bread and cheese. And because of the 1934 financial crisis, Graves was in dire straits. Like, he had big financial problems. In 1933, Graves is living Graves is living in Mallorca. At the time, he gained £4,000 worth of debt, £4,000. But that's a translation, but that £4,000 in 1933 is something like £400,000. So he was in significant financial difficulty. And whilst Graves had researched the concepts for I, Claudius prior to writing it, he knew that this was his last chance to make money and save his finances. So he had crazy publishing deadlines. It was written very, very quickly. The problem is Graves did not see it as what it is. He was so detached from the work. He didn't think it was a serious literary project. I, Claudius and Claudius the God brought in £8,000. Yeah, he got rid of his debt by writing those novels. For Graves, it was a quick, last minute a novel to save his finances, but realistically this man had been working all his life towards I, Claudius, from his translation work to his poetry to classical reading. It seemed like all of his experience kind of compounded to create this incredible work, which Graves didn't really acknowledge. I also want to acknowledge Graves' brother John, who also helped out with the project, and Irelis Roberts, who also helped out with the project. He didn't do it alone. But yeah, I think that's a fantastic story. What happens when all your experience kind of compounds and saves your ass? I think this is a great story, even though Graves was like, oh, he did not want to be associated with that work, really. We need to talk about the 1944 white goddess obsession. Graves got very much into paganism during this period. By this point, Graves had made quite a lot of money from I, Claudius and Claudius the God. And in 1944, Graves began obsessed with more Celtic folklore. So obviously his father was Irish, possibly identified as Celtic because the Celts come from many different countries. And Robert Graves created the white goddess theory. So during his research, Graves began preoccupied with the Cad Goddai, the Battle of the Trees. It's an ancient and cryptic Welsh poem from the Red Book of Hergus. He read it as a boy and he believed that he had cracked the code. He found the riddle of its hidden meaning. But he didn't believe that the trees from that poem were literally trees. He believed that they were the symbols for the letters of an ancient alphabet. Ogham, therefore, in turn, was a sacred lunar calendar. Within 3 weeks, he had produced a manuscript, 70k words in it, the Roebuck in the Thicket, which expanded into the White Goddess. And it was a radical departure from any of the Celtic studies he had done. Graves proposed that the ancient Celts, along with the prehistoric people of the Mediterranean, had worshipped the same god, the White Goddess. And whilst Graves is considered like a Celtologist, this was probably the most controversial work of his life. And to be honest, historians have not reacted well to his theories one historian called his theory spurious. Graves' lack of the Welsh language. He had to use Victorian translations. He had to use Victorian translations often written by English people. And Graves himself had admitted that these were unreliable, these Victorian translations. Because we didn't really have cultural influence until like David Lloyd George, but I'm not going to talk about that. The biggest problem about the White Goddess is that this book didn't sit on a shelf. It became quite famous in the 1960s. In fact, it was used by Wiccan and neo-pagan movements in the 1960s. And rather than historical accuracy, it was considered poetic truth. So this has been a very, very brief video of some of Robert Graves' work, from I, Claudius to the White Goddess theories. We haven't even touched on his work of him at war. So he wrote some poetry about him being at war. But for me, who's a classicist and you know, is interested in Celtology myself and interested in people who are into Celtology themselves, I think that he had a very mixed career. Even though he's like very loved in the UK, it's funny because the work he loved was bad, and yet I, Claudius is so celebrated. Like, it makes me wonder, right? Yeah. Two historians, right? Let's end it this way. Two historians. He's seen as a classical scholar with no distinction, pretty much. He wrote the most definitive novels of our time, and the most influential, and therefore the most influential classical media has come from Graves' work, and many people have been inspired by him. But was he a good historian? I don't think you have to be a good historian to make classics media. Claudius has touched many hearts and inspired hundreds of thousands to even look into what was historically accurate. Secondly, what we have now of classics is pretty much the Daily Mail, sidebar of shame. Varro was exiled, so Varro was exiled, and yet Plutarch's work thrived. And if people are complaining about a lack of historical accuracy in Robert Graves' work, they really need to look back at classics and who actually survived prescriptions lists. Because, trust me, the likes of Anthony and Caesar did not want the historically accurate accounts surviving anyway. Anyway, that's my conclusion. Thank you for watching our video, and then like and subscribe if... Oh, another thing as well, leave comments because I like waking up to them every morning.